and welcome to Westmusings, 10-minute museum talks, here this year in Phoenix, Arizona, at the Western Museums Association meeting 2016, with support provided by Attow Fine Arts Services and post-production being provided by Soulstream Studios. Our first speaker this evening is Noelle Kahanu. I had the good fortune of being introduced to Noelle through a conference that we had in Hawaii. At that time, I first met her under the great whale belly in the Central Hall of the Bishop Museum. She welcomed me to one of the most extraordinary museums on the planet with various layers of personal, global, colonial, pre-colonial stories that are totally overwhelming, and the kinds of things that make the work that we do in museums singular, magical, monumental, and personal. Noelle now is a professor at the local university in Hawaii and has the title of Assistant Specialist, Public Humanities and Native Hawaiian Programs Department of American Studies, University of Hawaii at Manoa. I give you Noelle Kahanu.
The moon on Jarvis Island just makes me long for you. Each lonely night as I sit in my shack, it brings memories of you. I am waiting for my ship to come in to take me back to you. But until that day, my heart aches and prays. Jarvis Moon makes me long for you.
Stories are everything. They tell us who we are and where we come from. Even the hula tells a story. Every motion brings to life the words in a song. And that song we just heard, that was my grandfather, George Kahanu, singing a song that he wrote with his companions on Jarvis Island in 1936. My grandfather was only 17 and still a student at Kamehameha schools in Honolulu when he was first recruited by the United States government to live on the island of Jarvis. Turns out that he would be one of over 130 young men from Hawaii who were sent to occupy the islands of Howland, Baker, Jarvis, Canton, and Enderbury between the years 1935 and 1942. If these young men were expecting a tropical paradise, they were sadly mistaken. For these islands were flat and barren, barely above sea level. A good-sized wave might wash over the entire island. The biggest was only 2 miles wide, and the islands were surrounded by shark-infested waters. They were covered with rats and mice and millions of birds. They were also ultimately exposed to enemy fire. But why were they on these islands? These islands were once mined for guano up until the mid-1800s. And it was unclear, however, who owned them because they had long since been abandoned. So ownership was unclear. But the rise in commercial aviation drew renewed interest in these islands because they were halfway between Australia and California. But international law required that they only be colonized by American citizens. So who better to live on these specks in the sea than Native Hawaiians? Known collectively as Hui Panala'au, or group of colonists, they lived in teams of 4 for months at a time. For $3 a day, they mapped the islands, they created landing strips for the airplanes, they fished and tried to farm, they took detailed weather readings, they collected specimens, and they kept a daily log. After a year of occupation, President Roosevelt was able to claim these islands in 1936, but still the project progressed. And these young men did more than just survive, they thrived. And it had everything to do with who they were as Americans and as Hawaiians. They played music on board the ship and on land. They built surfboards from shipwreck scraps. They rode outriggers in the roiling surf, and they caught and dried fish and packed them in saloon pilot tins for their families back home. Unfortunately, 3 of these young men would not make it home. Carl Kahalewai from a ruptured appendix, and Joe Kili'i Hananui and Dicky Whaley from a Japanese aerial attack the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed. But this is not a history lesson. This is about how some stories just want to be told. You see, I had never heard of this story, and this photo comes from my grandfather's own collection. And there he is kneeling in a white shirt on board the US Coast Guard cutter Itasca right before they head out to sea. But this was just a sliver in his entire lifespan, hardly worth mentioning. And indeed, this was a story that had largely faded from our community's collective consciousness. That is, until one day when an archivist at Bishop Museum, where I worked, asked me if I was related to a George Kahanu. And when I said yes, she disappeared into the closed stacks and returned with a faded green cloth-covered logbook. And within its lined pages was the handwriting of my grandfather and his companions describing life on a lonely island 1,000 miles from home. It turns out that Bishop Museum had much more than just his logbook. They had scores and scores of photographs and rare moving footage from the Department of Interior. And we had beautiful seashells and stuffed booby birds and stuffed rats, and we had fish floating in formaldehyde. So I know what you all are thinking, because I was thinking the same thing, which is this would make for a fabulous exhibit. But we did more than that. We sought out and found 8 of the surviving colonists, including my grandfather, and their stories formed the foundation of an exhibit called Hui Panala'au, Hawaiian Colonists, American Citizens. The media said that we had shone a light onto a dark chapter of modern history, and that we had used creativity and sensitivity to bring the past to life. But more importantly, I saw our community. I saw children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews and siblings and family and friends, all coming, searching, seeking for signs of their family patriarch, many of whom had long since gone. And for those still alive, they shone like stars once again in the twilight of their lives. After the exhibit opened in 2002, it went on and traveled throughout the state. But 2 years later, we were able to rebury Joe Kili'i Hananui and Dicky Whaley at the Kaneohe Veterans Cemetery and give them a place of honor and distinction. And still the story wasn't over, and more research at the National Archives uncovered government documents which proved the military significance and underpinnings of this project. And that led to a documentary under a Jarvis moon which delved into the political and historical complexities. It's been seen by tens of thousands, and still the story is not over because last year the United States Senate passed a measure recognizing the contributions and sacrifices of these men. But it's bittersweet because all but one of them are gone. And my grandfather at the age of 98 passed away last November. I used to see federal legislation as the end goal, that we would finally grant them the recognition that they so honorably deserved. But I've since come to realize that it is not about what happens in our nation's capital thousands of miles away. Rather, it's about what happens right at home. Like when 125 fifth graders from Kamehameha wrote a play in honor of their alumni and the Hui Panala'au. And they took to the stage and sang and danced to the very song that started us on our journey today. Museums, we are at our very best when we celebrate community. We are the memory keepers, and it's up to us to be more than passive repositories, but active participants in keeping lost stories alive. All of us have been taught that we have to separate our personal lives from the workplace. But what we do has everything to do with who we are. And all of us have stories, stories within us, stories within our families, stories within our communities. Some are sung, some are dreamed, some are written, some are woven into the very fabric of our institutions, tucked into a storage drawer or filed amongst faded papers. Listen to the call. Follow your passions and speak of what moves you, because once in a while, under a Jarvis moon, the personal and the professional can be one.